The foundation looks solid, but we need to verify the permits.
Agreed. Let's pull up the specs. I'm on it. All set.
A violation notice for what?
The lawn ornaments. It says they don't comply.
That's ridiculous. We have to fight this.
You're right. Let's go.
They showed up like storm clouds, papers in hand, enforcers at their side, ready to lecture, fine, and intimidate. My wife and I stood frozen for a moment, caught in that sharp, suffocating tension only an HOA gone rogue can create. Rules nobody reads, penalties nobody understands. Yet here they were, wielding power like it was a weapon. And then she stepped forward, one glance, one calm move, and the room changed. Suddenly, the enforcers hesitated, the paper shook in their hands, and the entire scene felt different. What could she possibly have that made them falter, and could it turn the tables completely? Our street was the kind of place people dreamed about. Manicured lawns, friendly waves over white picket fences, and quiet evenings where kids rode bikes until the sun sank behind the trees. We had moved here 5 years ago, chasing a sense of stability, a place where our daughter could grow up safe, and where weekends smelled of fresh-cut grass and barbecues. Life was predictable and comfortable, until it wasn't. My wife, always sharp and level-headed, loved tending to our small garden by the side porch, while I spent evenings tinkering in the garage or walking the dog down the winding sidewalks. We knew our neighbors by name, smiled at passing strangers, and thought we had a sense of belonging. But in the background, subtle rules hovered, HOA regulations most people ignored, quietly tightening their grip like invisible strings. A neighbor's complaints, whispered over fences, carried more weight than we realized. Petty infractions that seemed trivial on paper, an unapproved flag, a slightly overgrown hedge, were quietly being logged, setting the stage for confrontation. It started with a notice slipped under our door, a crisp envelope stamped with the HOA seal. No explanation, no prior warning, just the threat of fines, inspections, and enforcers ready to act. At first, we thought it was a clerical mistake, something minor, easily brushed aside. But the tension lingered, a faint unease settling into our routine, like a shadow over the sunny front yard. We had no idea how quickly a quiet neighborhood could turn into a battlefield. It started small, almost imperceptibly. The first notice was simple enough. Our garden gnomes were not in compliance with HOA aesthetic guidelines. A fine of $50 loomed if we didn't remove them. I remember staring at the paper, incredulous. Gnomes. My wife had spent hours arranging them just right, giving our front yard a touch of whimsy. We removed them, but that tiny concession only emboldened the HOA. A week later, the mailbox. Another notice. This time, the complaint was about our driveway, a single crack in the concrete. Unsafe and unsightly, it read. They demanded repairs immediately, threatening escalating fines. We had never imagined that something so trivial could carry so much weight. My wife sighed, frustration furrowing her brow. It's like they're looking for reasons, she said, more to herself than to me. And she was right. Then came the inspections. Men in crisp polos, clipboards in hand, patrolling the neighborhood like predators. Every window, every hedge, every inch of lawn was scrutinized. I watched them peer over fences, their eyes scanning for infractions we didn't even know existed. Our neighbors tried to reassure us. Just ignore them, it'll pass. But the unease was growing. The whispers at community meetings hinted at a deeper problem. A few individuals within the HOA had begun using their positions as a source of power, relishing petty authority. Soon the fines piled up. Minor offenses, an unauthorized welcome mat, a slightly overgrown bush, a trash can left out for a few hours too long, became opportunities for harassment. Each notice hit like a slap in the face, and every inspection felt like an invasion. I remember opening one letter, heart sinking, as they claimed our holiday decorations were excessive and disruptive. The absurdity was maddening, but the threat of thousands of dollars in fines made it impossible to ignore. Then the neighbor interference began. It wasn't just the HOA anymore. Certain residents seemed to take pleasure in reporting minor infractions. One afternoon, I caught a neighbor watching our backyard from across the street. A camera lens glinted in the sunlight as they scribbled in a notebook. My stomach turned. Our privacy was being weaponized. The petty disputes snowballed, each complaint escalating into an official notice, each notice triggering more anxiety. The The sense of helplessness was overwhelming.
My wife tried to keep things civil. She spoke calmly at community meetings, questioned the rulings, asked for clarification, but every attempt to reason was met with condescension or dismissal. The HOA board members, faces set in stern expressions, seemed to thrive on the tension. They reminded us repeatedly that they had the authority to enforce rules however they saw fit. And they did. The stress began to seep into our daily lives. Sleepless nights, tense mornings, awkward greetings with neighbors who had once been friendly. I remember one moment vividly. We had just returned from a weekend trip. Our house was quiet, everything seemingly normal. Then we noticed a bright orange notice on the front door, a new violation. Apparently, a single blade of grass had crossed the boundary line of our neighbor's property, a technicality, a line almost invisible to the naked eye. The fine? $200. My wife's hands shook as she held the letter. "This is ridiculous," she whispered. "They're inventing rules now." I didn't argue. I just felt the gnawing tension of inevitability, like being trapped in a game with rules that changed by the second. The psychological toll was relentless. Each day brought the fear of the next inspection, the next complaint, the next fine. Friends tried to offer advice, but none had experienced the relentless, almost theatrical pettiness of a rogue HOA. The community, once a sanctuary, became a minefield. Every smile from a neighbor felt cautious, every wave suspicious. Even simple pleasures, watering the lawn, letting the dog run in the yard, were now weighed against potential scrutiny. And then came the confrontation we had been dreading. A new notice demanded immediate compliance with a rule we hadn't even known existed: the exact positioning of our garbage bins during collection day. The penalty for improper placement was $500. My wife's patience finally snapped. She drafted a response, calmly but firmly disputing every infraction, citing the HOA's own guidelines, the minutes of past meetings, and even local property laws. The next inspection day, we braced ourselves. The enforcers arrived, confident and aloof, expecting compliance. But my wife stood her ground. She answered questions with precision, never raising her voice, but her presence carried authority that seemed to catch them off guard. For the first time, I saw hesitation in their eyes, the subtle shift from certainty to doubt. The tension in the air was electric. I could feel it in every clench of my fists, every shallow breath. Yet the battle wasn't over. The HOA retaliated, sending more letters, threatening liens and escalating fines. The petty neighborhood politics intensified. Some neighbors whispered behind our backs, while others watched eagerly, waiting for the next misstep. Each day was a careful dance. One wrong move could spark a new infraction. But beneath the stress, a sense of determination began to grow. My wife and I realized that playing by their rules alone would never win this war. We needed leverage, strategy, and the courage to push back. By this point, the community meetings had become spectacles. Board members spoke with clipped authority, reading pre-written statements as if rehearsed from maximum intimidation. Complaints from neighbors were paraded like trophies, each anecdote designed to shame us publicly. Yet with each hearing, my wife's calm defiance became more pronounced. Her arguments were rooted in logic and law, yet delivered with a quiet power that unsettled the board. The audience began to shift. Murmurs of support, subtle nods from neighbors hinted that the tide might be turning. But the real turning point came with an unexpected twist. A neighbor who had long supported the HOA's heavy-handed approach accidentally revealed critical information, a loophole in the enforcement process that invalidated many of the fines. My wife caught it immediately, and we realized that the leverage we needed to fight back had been hiding in plain sight all along. We didn't act yet. Every confrontation had to be timed perfectly. The suspense, the anticipation, the frustration, all of it had been leading to a moment where the board's authority could finally be challenged head-on. And just as we were gathering our strategy, another notice arrived. The envelope was thicker this time, ominous in its weight. We opened it to find a new unexplained penalty, this one for alleged unauthorized modifications to the exterior of the home. My wife read it carefully, then looked at me with a calm that belied the storm around us. "They're pushing too far this time," she said. And I knew she was right. The stage was set. The conflict that had been simmering for months was about to erupt in a confrontation that neither side would forget. The day of the big showdown arrived like a storm rolling over our quiet street. The HOA had scheduled a special meeting, one they insisted was mandatory for all homeowners under review. The notice had that same cold, bureaucratic precision, bold letters, threats of escalating fines, and a tone that made it clear they expected us to submit without question. But this time, my wife and I were ready. Months of harassment, endless fines, and petty complaints had built a quiet fire in us, and now we were about to strike. We walked into the community hall early, the polished floors reflecting the tension in the air. Board members were already seated behind a long table, expressions rigid, eyes scanning the room like hawks. The enforcers lingered near the edges, clipboard in hand, waiting for us to falter. A few neighbors whispered among themselves, casting sideways glances at us, some curious, some smug. I felt a lump in my throat, but my wife's calm confidence radiated like a shield between us and the storm. The meeting began with the usual formalities: roll call, recitation of HOA rules, and the perfunctory reading of violations. One by one, they cited our alleged infractions: garden gnomes, driveway cracks, misaligned trash bins, even the orientation of a single flower pot. Each accusation landed with the weight of bureaucracy, meant to humiliate and intimidate. I could see my wife's jaw tighten, her eyes flicking between the board members and the enforcers. She had rehearsed her responses, but even so, the sheer audacity of their claims was staggering. Then came the real shock, a new allegation that none of us had seen before, a claim that our home's exterior modifications violated the community's architectural guidelines. They presented photos taken by a neighbor, evidence that had been collected over weeks. The room seemed to lean in, waiting for our reaction. The board members exchanged smug smiles, confident that they had finally cornered us. I felt my blood pressure spike. This was the peak of their power, the culmination of months of relentless harassment, and they expected us to break. But my wife didn't flinch. Slowly, deliberately, she rose to speak. Her voice was calm, measured, but carried an unmistakable authority. She began by addressing each violation in turn, citing HOA guidelines, municipal codes, and past meeting minutes. Every fine they had issued, every notice they had sent, she dismantled point by point. Her arguments were precise, logical, and unassailable. You could see the subtle shifts in the room. The board members' rigid expressions wavered, their confidence cracking. The enforcers glanced at one another, unease spreading across their faces. And then came the bombshell. My wife presented a document she had discovered in the HOA's own archives, a procedural loophole that invalidated the majority of the fines and penalties. It was technical, obscure, but undeniable. The board members fumbled, attempting to explain, to object, to regain control, but the room had changed. Neighbors who had once whispered now stared openly, some nodding in approval, others incredulous at the audacity of the HOA's miscalculations. The tension skyrocketed as she pressed the point further. She outlined clearly and publicly how the HOA had overstepped its authority, how fines had been levied improperly, and how their own enforcement policies had been inconsistent at best, illegal at worst. Each statement landed like a hammer strike, echoing through the hall. The enforcers shifted uneasily. The board members' smug smiles were gone, replaced by red-faced anxiety. The energy in the room was electric, half anticipation, half disbelief. Then she revealed the final piece of leverage, a legal letter from an attorney confirming that any further enforcement of these invalid fines could be challenged in court, with potential personal liability for board members who continued to act outside their authority. The silence was deafening. You could feel the weight of the room pivoting, the scales of power tipping irrevocably. The board members whispered among themselves, desperate to regain some semblance of control, but it was too late. The momentum had shifted completely. But the climax wasn't just legal, it was personal. One of the board members, a man who had taken particular pleasure in our harassment, attempted a last-ditch effort, a condescending lecture meant to shame my wife into submission. She didn't flinch. Instead, she calmly recounted every instance of overreach, every petty complaint, every violation that had been improperly cited. Her voice didn't rise, but each word carried a weight that made the room lean in. By the time she finished, the man's face had turned pale, his words trapped in his throat. It was a public humiliation of the HOA's enforcer-in-chief, delivered with quiet precision. The neighbors reacted instantly. Some applauded softly, others murmured their agreement. The board members attempted to regroup, but the tide had turned. My wife had exposed the absurdity, the hypocrisy, and the pettiness of the entire system. The enforcers, once confident and intimidating, now looked like strangers in a room they had tried to dominate. The power dynamic had shifted entirely. And just as we thought the confrontation was over, a final twist arrived. One of the board members, desperate and flustered, attempted to introduce a new violation, a desperate attempt to regain authority. But my wife anticipated it. She had reviewed the community bylaws thoroughly and had the perfect rebuttal prepared. In one sentence, she dismantled the claim, citing the very rules the HOA claimed to uphold. The enforcers froze, the board members sputtered, and the room erupted not in chaos, but in stunned silence, followed by murmurs of disbelief and approval. At that moment, it became clear the HOA could no longer assert its petty control over us. Every threat, every fine, every attempt to intimidate had backfired spectacularly. The peak of their abuse had been met with precision, preparation, and quiet authority. My wife had not just defended our home, she had exposed the flaws in the system, delivered justice in real time, and shown the neighborhood that standing up to arbitrary power was possible. And yet, the air still held tension. The board members retreated, muttering under their breath, while enforcers collected their clipboards, unsure of how to respond. Our neighbors looked on with awe, some silently congratulating us, others reconsidering their own positions in the community hierarchy. It was a victory, yes, but it was also a turning point, a moment where the battle ended publicly, but the ripple effects were just beginning. As we left the hall that day, walking back to our home, the street felt different. The sunlight on the lawn seemed sharper, the quiet home of suburban life more alive. But in the back of my mind, I knew that battles like this never truly ended. They simply shifted. The HOA might regroup, new enforcers could arrive, and petty rules might appear again. Yet, for the first time in months, we felt a sense of control, a quiet triumph born from preparation, patience, and courage. After the storm in the community hall, a strange calm settled over our neighborhood. The air felt lighter, almost tangible, as if the tension that had gripped the streets for months had finally dissipated. Our yard, once the battleground for petty fines and arbitrary inspections, now seemed like a sanctuary again. But the victory wasn't immediate. It unfolded slowly in subtle but unmistakable ways that reshaped our lives and perhaps the culture of the entire HOA. The first sign came the very next day. Notices of new fines stopped arriving. Weeks passed, and the enforcement team did not show up at our door. The letters that once landed like small, threatening missiles now lay dormant in a stack of unread envelopes. The board members, previously emboldened by bureaucracy, retreated to their offices and their meetings. Their authority, which had seemed absolute, had been shaken to its core. Even those neighbors who had once complained or whispered now approached with cautious respect, or at the very least, silence. It was as if the balance of power had subtly, irrevocably shifted. Our lives began to return to normal, but with an added sense of vigilance. My wife and I knew that the fight had changed us, had sharpened us in ways we hadn't anticipated. We no longer approached our home with a passive assumption that the neighborhood's rules were fair. Instead, we approached with awareness and preparedness. Even something as simple as watering the garden or letting the dog run in the yard was no longer routine. It was an act of reclaiming space that had been under siege for too long. Neighbors started noticing the change too. Quiet conversations began in backyards and on sidewalks. Some admitted in hushed tones that they had felt powerless before, intimidated by petty rules and aggressive enforcement. Others confessed that they had admired our persistence but feared retaliation. Slowly, a subtle shift took hold in the community. People began questioning the HOA's actions more openly. The culture of fear, the one built on fines, arbitrary rules, and neighbor complaints, began to unravel brick by brick. It was a ripple effect that no board member had anticipated. A few weeks later, the HOA sent a formal communication to all homeowners. The tone was markedly different, less condescending, less threatening. There were mentions of clarifying rules, reviewing procedures, and even creating a system for appeals. Reading it, I could sense a reluctant acknowledgement of their errors, a grudging admission that their authority was not unassailable. It was a small step, but for us, it was monumental. Months of harassment, anxiety, and tension had forced a community that had once been passive and complacent to confront its own overreach.